Oh, let's go to the Lord in prayer, shall we? Dear Lord, again, we're so privileged to be able to once again open your word, to partake from what you have for us tonight. Lord, I pray that you will open our hearts, open our minds, and even though something may not be said, let something strike a chord in our heart that'll give us that nourishment that we need for tonight. And Lord, I'm going to ask that you anoint my lips, anoint your word, anoint our hearts, and we'll thank and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Breakfast anyway, y'all.
All right, tonight's
Plenty
lesson.
of dinners for it.
Tonight's lesson is going to be fairly short. We're just going to cover the first chapter tonight. There's a couple of reasons for it. One, we're going to talk a little bit about some background material on the book, and so that'll take a little time. And the second chapter is quite large, so we'll probably just have room next week to cover, or next lesson, to cover that second chapter. May get the third, but again, they're long chapters, so there's only 12 there are only 12 of them, but there's a lot of verses in some of them, so, and a lot of material to cover.
I don't have any extras.
Okay, the book of Daniel is probably one of the books in the Bible that has come under the most fire from non-believers of any book in the Bible. There are those that have just flat said it's a fraud, it's a fake, it was not written when it says it was written, it was actually written during the Maccabees, or there's all kinds of things that have come up about the book of Daniel. The primary reason for that is because Daniel is primarily a book of prophecy, and by that I mean, we read through Isaiah, and of course Isaiah was prophecy, you know, it was all this stuff was going to happen at the end times. But with Daniel, it's a little bit different. He's very graphic in what he shows. The beasts that he sees, the image, all of these things are very, very, not only are they very vivid, but he gives the interpretation. He says this is what this is. And these people that are critical of Daniel are those that do not believe in biblical prophecy. They don't believe that you can actually prophesy into the future. These are a lot of these people are, if not atheists, they are at least agnostics. They may believe that God is there, but he's really not. He doesn't really interact with us. He doesn't really want us to know what's going to happen. He kind of winds us up, lets us go, and says, "Okay, let everything happen as it's going to happen." Well, this seems strange, but this is the predominant belief in the world today. God just winds us up, lets us go. Whatever happens, happens.
So they've taken the free will thing too far.
Well, yes, God isn't really, it's not a matter of really, God isn't really dead, he's still there, but he doesn't really care what's going on. This is our world, he's given it to us, and we do what we want to with it. Okay?
It looks like it too.
Yeah, and however it turns out, it's going to turn out. Yeah, this is the whole thing. And so what comes from that is this idea that the world revolves around me. I am the most important thing in the entire universe. And you are the most important thing in the entire universe. So as long as me is happy and me is prosperous, then everything is good and God is happy. If me is not prosperous or me is not happy, God is not happy. But God is not going to intervene or do anything. And when that seems really strange, but look around you. We saw this really bud out in the 60s with the hippie generation. Free love, free everything, free drugs. It didn't matter as long as it felt good, do it. If it feels good, do it.
And those are
This
the
was
people
the
that are in
idea.
control now.
What's that?
And those are the people that are in control now.
Yes, they are. Yes, they very much are.
Yes.
Although I will say a lot of them learned their lesson. And some of them, there's not a lot of them in control because none of them are mentally, have enough mental capabilities left to be in control of anything. But actually, but this is kind of where it really came to the surface. And the new religions that we have today, this new thrust, if you really look at it, it's nothing more than it's ever been. It's worshiping me. And if you go back, we went through Isaiah and all the idol worship. If you really look at those idols, a lot of them were fertility idols, This was the idea that I am going to prosper if I worship this idol. So it was all based on what I can get and what that idol or that whatever it is can give me. And I will say we see that today in our economics. These guys, in fact, I read on them, I don't know if you were on, I was on the web today, and they're talking about that Simmons mattress company, bedding company, is in trouble. They're going to have to file bankruptcy. And the reason is because these holding companies have purchased them, and it's been through a series of these holding companies, and the holding companies don't really care if Simmons prospers or not. They don't care. They make their money. Simmons is really making a great net profit. But what they do is they borrow the money to purchase the company. Then after they purchase the company, they borrow more money to give themselves their money. And so then they turn around and sell the company. And so somebody else borrows money to buy the company, borrows money to pay themselves back. Well, all of this debt gets piled on top of the company. So in this case, Simmons owes us something like $1.8 billion in debt. And when it originally started, they only had like, I don't know, $3 million or $4 million in debt. Well, they can't pay that back. I mean, you know, it's one of those situations. So they go into bankruptcy, and what happens? Their employees get laid off, people lose jobs. The people that invested in Simmons originally, they lose their money, and the loan companies, they lose their money. But guess what? These holding companies have all made money to the tunes of millions of dollars in net profit. Why? Because it's a situation where let me prosper and the rest of the world can just go jump in a lake. It doesn't matter. I'm gonna leverage this as far as I can leverage it, make every penny I can before I have to bail out. You see, and that's a whole different idea than what it was originally intended to be. God didn't intend for us to prosper as individuals. He intended for humanity to prosper. And there's a big difference between individual prosperity and humanity prosperity. And it carries over to the church. This is in the church very prevalent. It's a matter of what I can get rather than what God can get or what the church can get. We don't want to share what we have. It's ours. I want to hang on to that. It's a mental, just a mind state that we have. And I could go into it, but that's just a little bit of kind of where this idea comes from, that Daniel isn't really what it says it is. Okay? But I want you to notice something. Jesus referred to the prophecies in this book as having been spoken by Daniel. That's Matthew 24:15. And of course, it referred to there to Daniel 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11. You can look these scriptures up later. So he referred to them specifically as having been spoken by Daniel. Now this is interesting because this is prior to the Maccabees. So if this was written during the period, Daniel was actually written during the period of the Maccabees, then Jesus was looking into the future to speak the words.
Who are the Maccabees?
You see?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
What's that?
Who are the Maccabees?
I'm sorry? Oh, the Maccabees? The Maccabees were a bunch of, we would call them zealots. They were rebels. They were in Jerusalem during Jesus' day. They were the ones, Barabbas was thought to be of a zealot type person. But after the fall of Jerusalem, after 70 AD, when Jerusalem fell, and it was the Roman, was really strong. They really came in then. The Maccabees launched a big revolt, and they put an army together. They came against Rome, and it was kind of like it was kind of this urban warfare thing. I mean, if you read the history of it, they would ambush these Roman legions and take pieces and parts of them, and they were pretty ingenious in the way that they fought. Of course, Rome finally conquered them and defeated them, but the Maccabees actually won some liberation in Israel for a short period of time before Rome decided to send another couple of legions in there and just stomp them out. But that was basically the Maccabees. And during that period of time, the Maccabees is what we call the silent years between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament. It's about 400 years. where we don't have anything that's in our book written. But the Maccabean period, there's a lot of books that were written during that period that were not included in the Bible. Some say that they were inspired, some say they weren't inspired, and I'm not going to get into that hassle. There were some pretty good books. Book of Enoch, for instance, was written during the time of the Maccabees. So that was just kind of what that was, but it was after Jesus Christ came and died. And so he refers to Daniel by name. Also, he speaks of himself as being the Son of Man coming from heaven as the fallen stone in judgment, and that was in Matthew 24:30, and of course that was a direct reference to Daniel 7 and 13. And then Matthew 21:44 again refers to Daniel 2:44 and 45. You can look these up. This is just some proofs. Also, the Jews and the early Christians universally accepted the book as genuine and Daniel as the author. So as close to Daniel as you can get, they are accepting him as, in fact, the author of this book and in the time that he said it happened. And also, evangelical scholars today identify the author of the book with the Daniel of Ezekiel 14, 14, 20, and 28 and 3. Now, this is kind of important because part of the excuse that these guys give is that Ezekiel refers to Daniel as a man, a very pious man, full of wisdom and well thought of in the world. And they were saying he could not be living at the same time as Ezekiel was living. How would he have this kind of fame and still be a relatively young man? Well, when we get into the book, I think we'll see that, yeah, that was probably exactly the case, okay? Not only that, in these chapters, well, let me just read one of them to you. I'm not going to try to explain the chapter, the verse to you, but I just want to read this part of it. In Ezekiel 14:14, it says, though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. And what they're saying is a couple of things. One, Daniel is sandwiched between Noah and Job. And so if you look at this from a time perspective, they're saying, well, he should have fallen someplace in time between Noah and Job. Is that true? Well, does it have to be true? And I don't really think that it does. I don't think this has anything to do with time. Daniel was just being mentioned as a person on the same level as Noah and Job. And what were they known for? Righteousness. Noah was a righteous man, therefore he was saved from the flood. Job was a righteous man, prayed for his kids every day and sacrificed, and therefore he went through the trial, but was brought out of that trial and given even greater than he had going into the trial. Just a moment, let me check this thing. It went off back here. I want to make sure I'm getting this. Yeah, okay. Screensaver came off. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is their argument. But in no way does this scripture have to indicate any kind of time frame or that one should come before the other or one was greater than the other. Ezekiel is merely showing that here were three men who went through trials and came out victorious because of their own souls. They delivered their own souls by their righteousness. They delivered their own souls by their righteousness. That's an important point, and we're going to see this when we get into Daniel. All right. And finally, Josephus, who was the great Hebrew historian, relates that when Alexander the Great, who's mentioned in the 8th chapter of Daniel, by the way, when he entered Jerusalem in 332 BC, he defeated the Medes and the Persians, came into Jerusalem. He was greatly impressed by the writing of Daniel because he saw himself in there. So this pretty much limits, I think, the idea that the Maccabees, or something in the period of the Maccabees, actually wrote, some great Hebrew scholar wrote Daniel during the period of the Maccabees. The first philosopher, the guy who really started this whole movement, and doubted the authenticity of the book, was Porphyry. Well, I say get named like Smith. And that was in 260 AD. Porphyry. Porphyry. Anyway, he ascribed the book to a Jew who lived during the Maccabean struggle for independence in 165 BC. There's several reasons why this cannot be, but this is probably the strongest one against this, is that the Septuagint version of the Old Testament includes Daniel. Now, why is that so important? Well, the reason is because it was translated in 265 BC by, and that's when 72 Jews, that was 6 from each tribe, were sent to Alexandria by Eleazar at the request of Demetrius Phalereus, the king's librarian. And their task was to completed in 72 days. And that's well before the Maccabean period. And of course, we know that the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And that, by the way, is what was used primarily in the New Testament. So when Jesus quoted, he was quoting from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew text in most cases. It's just a little thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind, because you will hear Jews, Orthodox Jews at times say, well, that can't be true because it doesn't match the Hebrew text. Well, it's one translation away from the Hebrew text, because Jesus used the Septuagint, which was Greek.
Can you spell Septuagint?
Can I spell it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I have it written down.
That's good.
Septuagint. Septuagint.
G.
Septuagint. Septuagint.
Okay.
Okay, the date that the book was written was sometime between 606 and 536 BC, and that was during the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. What we don't know is if Daniel wrote the book in one sitting or if Daniel wrote it in pieces. There's some indication there that he may have written this as he saw things and recorded them. Or it could have been at the end when he was writing his memoirs and he wrote this. So we're not sure on the exact date. Sometime within that 70-year period, Daniel wrote the book. Now there's some divisions in the book, and they're very logical. I made another chart up and then forgot to print it for you, but it's not that big a deal. The most apparent is that the first 6 chapters of the book are historical and deal primarily with events surrounding the royalty of Babylon. Next chapter we're going to find about Nebuchadnezzar's dream and what Nebuchadnezzar did and how he was turned into a beast of the field and all these things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. There was this history of primarily the rulers of Babylon and what happened during that period of time. The last 6 books are prophetic in nature and have to do with the dreams of Daniel. What he dreamed, what he saw, what he interpreted. So that is the most apparent and very logical look at the book and how it's divided. There is a much more obscure and yet very powerful division in the book that you need to be aware of. Because again, when God does things, he doesn't just halfway do things. He really makes sure that the point is made when he wants to make a point about something. If you look at chapters 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, the first part of the verse, I can read that verse 4 to you. If I get back to Daniel here. Yeah, if I go around, I forget to flip back where I was, and then I'm in trouble. chapter 2 and verse 4, up to this verse, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. Now Syriac was the language of Babylon. That would be the Chaldeans. Syriac or Chaldea was the language, and it was actually the language of commerce and business. So it would be very much like today. Our language of business and commerce is English. If you're going to be an airline pilot, you have to understand English. We use English in just about everything that we do in the world. So it's the same idea here, only they use Syriac. But once he said the word Syriac, or wrote the word Syriac, from there on, he stopped writing in Hebrew and wrote in Syriac. It's kind of strange to stop in the middle of a thought, or actually in the middle of the sentence, if you will, and switch over to start writing in Syriac or Chaldean. And he does that until he gets to chapters 8, verse 1 through 12, verse 13, and he switches back then to Hebrew. Well, you say, why? He was really confused. Maybe this was two writers. Maybe this was two writers. That's what a lot of people say. This is two writers. Well, if you really look at those chapters, the first two chapters up through verse 4 is slanted toward the Hebrews, the Jews, Israel. From the second half of the 4th verse until the 8th chapter, it's slanted toward the Gentiles. It talks about the judgment and the events that are going to surround the Gentiles, or those that speak Chaldean. 8th verse, it swings back, and Daniel begins to bring hope and begins to bring talking about the deliverance of Israel, which again is slanted toward the Hebrews. So he writes it in Hebrew. Does that make sense? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't things about the Gentiles in their Hebrew portion, or there isn't things about Israel in the Gentile portion, but it's slanted toward that. That is what the primary focus of those verses are. Okay? So I think that is a far more powerful division than merely the idea that the first 4 are historical and the last 4 are prophetical. It actually tells you and gives you an idea of who he's writing to and who he's writing about. Okay, let's get into the book. All right. We're going to start off in chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to be looking at the fall of Jerusalem. And Daniel presents it from a rather unique point of view. He is already a captive, but he writes this in the third person. He doesn't say he was involved at all, but we know that he was. Because later on we're going to find out what was going on. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now there's a couple of things here that we need to be aware of. If you just read this, it looks like Nebuchadnezzar came in, laid siege to Jerusalem, took the vessels, and went off back to his own country, and that was it. Actually, this happened at two different times. Give you a little history. Pharaoh Necho, the Pharaoh of Egypt, led the Egyptian army in a crusade against Babylon. Now, at this time, Egypt was the, I guess probably the strongest country in the world at that time. If you can imagine, they would march out of Egypt. And there's some accounts that I've read that they actually had a big bridge that was built across what we would term the Red Sea. but it was where the Red Sea narrows down before it goes into the, I believe it's the Mediterranean right there. It's a very close landmass right in there. And they actually had a bridge that was built over that area of the sea. And so when they wanted to go to war, they would take their armies, this was a huge bridge, and they would march their armies and their chariots over that bridge, and then they would come up through the wilderness area there, right up into Palestine, would be Palestine today, and from there then they could go wherever they wanted in the then known world, or powerful parts of the world, and they could wage war and they could conquer or whatever. Now they were not the ruling class of the world that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon was to be, or the Medes and the Persians. Part of that was a matter of distance. Because what would happen, you know, they decide they're going to go to war and they get everybody together and they go flying out across this bridge. Well, everybody had spies. And so when the spies saw the army getting ready to cross the bridge, they'd go home and tell, you know, it would take them a couple of weeks to get back to Babylon, for instance, and say, hey, Pharaoh and his army's coming. Well, it's not like today. If we want to go wage war, you know, within a matter of a week, we can have enough tanks and airplanes and army to wage a pretty good battle. It took a year or more for them. When you think about it, you know, they didn't have the things we have today. So when they went marching out across the wilderness, they didn't have big food wagons with them. And they didn't have all of this with them, so they had to live pretty much off of the land. So they had parts of their army that was dedicated to going into cities, and they would just tear the city, you know, take all the food and whatever was there they could take it back to feed the army. And we saw this in Isaiah. We talked about, you know, how the armies would just pillage everything and take just tramp the fields down, whatever they needed, they went and got. So this also says that they tended to wage war when the crops were ready, so they could find food. You know, they were pretty smart in that way. So they would march out and go, well, while this is going on, of course, it took them a long time to get from where they were going, started to where they were going. And by that time, the kings could get together and form alliances and get huge armies. And so Egypt, a lot of times, would change course. I'm not going to go there, we're going to go over here and take this littler place, it's easier. Right? They may have had the singular greatest army, but when you start putting a lot of armies together, it became a different situation. So the distance, for one thing, limited their ability to really be the world ruler. I think arguably you could say they were the smartest in a lot of ways, especially when you look at the pyramids and some of the things they built. Their armaments were far superior to most of the other countries. They were very advanced civilization. But they never progressed to the point of Babylon and Medes and the Persians, those who resided in that area and could move armies fairly quickly and get to places and do damage before big alliances could be formed. So this was Babylon. Well, I mean, this was Egypt. So they came out and they had decided they were going to wage war with Babylon. Now, they had waged war before. They had defeated Babylon to some degree, but never went into Babylon and actually taken the city or anything. They defeated the armies, you know, and it was battle one here, battle one there. But they decided they were going to do the job. So they took off to do this. And Nebuchadnezzar, the one we term as Nebuchadnezzar, actually was the son of Nebuchadnezzar the first. And Nebuchadnezzar the first was an elderly man at this point. And so he gave Nebuchadnezzar some of his army. And I found that to be interesting. Just some of his army. Nebuchadnezzar the prince took off with some of the army of Babylon, met the Egyptian army, defeated them, sent them back to Egypt. Now this was no small task. Of course, it just propelled Nebuchadnezzar in the eyes of the world as being somebody who was extremely powerful. If he could take part of an army and defeat this mighty army of Egypt, he was really somebody. Well, of course, reading in Isaiah, we understand why he was really somebody. Because remember, God said, I took the nations, and I caused them to be in derision, and I gave them to you. It wouldn't have mattered how big the army of Egypt was or how well armed they were. God gave them to Nebuchadnezzar. See, God was interfering here. God was not interfering, but God was in control. Well, after he ran Pharaoh back down to Egypt, Egypt, being as powerful, one of the countries they had overrun was Palestine, and they were in control basically of Judah. And remember, we read in Isaiah how the king made a pact with Egypt, and so Egypt was the protectorate of Israel or Judah, and of course they paid taxes to Egypt, and in return Egypt was supposed to protect them. Well, here's the protectorate headed, with his tail between his legs, headed back down into Egypt, and there was nobody to protect Judah. And Judah was a very, very sought-after country, because not only was it situated where there was a lot of trade going through it, but they were very skilled in a lot of science, what we term science, and we'll get into that in a minute, that was not prevalent in other parts of the world, for instance, Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar decided, since he ran off the Egyptians and there was nobody in his way, he'd just go down and take Judah too. So he marched in and laid siege to Jerusalem. It was a very short siege. Now also, the king in Jerusalem was Jehoiakim. Now Jehoiakim was not the rightful king to the throne. Well, I won't say that. Maybe he would have been, but he wasn't. His younger brother was actually put on the throne by the Jews. Now, his younger brother was anything but a righteous man. He was completely unqualified for the job, and was a very wicked and very stupid king, I guess is the best way to put it, in the way he did things. And so Nebuchadnezzar took him out off of the throne and put his older brother in his place, Jehoiakim. Now Jehoiakim was listed as being the most ungodly king of all of them. And that even includes Manasseh, and we heard about him, what he did. But this guy was really, really stupid and ungodly and unqualified. So he was put on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar. And the idea being, putting him on the throne, of course, he would then be very easy to manipulate and they wouldn't have any problems. Well, Nebuchadnezzar then left, and at that point he took some of the furniture or vessels from the temple and took them back with him, as well as some of the brightest young men in Israel. Most of those, it was assumed, were boys of royalty. Now their exact ages we don't know, but they were the ones that had the most potential and also had a good understanding of their country and the sciences of their country. Okay? So Nebuchadnezzar's idea was, if we take some of the furniture from the temple, then that's going to, the vessels, that's going to let them know that their God is not very powerful. I can come in and take stuff out of his temple, no problem. So I have more power. So that was a point of showing them how much power he had. He was taking the young men for a couple of reasons. One, probably the idea that these are hostages. So I'm not going to have the royalty in Judah, so anxious to lead a revolt against me if I have their kids. Pretty good thinking. But also, one thing about Babylon was they really were thirsty, if you will, for knowledge. Knowledge is what they were really after. And if you had a lot of knowledge and areas they didn't understand, you were very costly to them, or not costly, what's the word? They wanted you, okay? And if he could have somebody in his court that was really good in music, for instance, which Judah was, or Israel was known for their music. If he had somebody in his court that was and understood that music, or was really good at some of the other sciences, then that added to his prestige, as well as they were able to teach others in the court. Okay? So he took these men. Well, 3 years went by, and Jehoiakim decided that, hey, I don't need Nebuchadnezzar. We can do without him, so we're just going to revolt. So he revolted, and of course here came Nebuchadnezzar again, This time he laid siege to Jerusalem, and the siege lasted a year and a half. And you can read about that in 2 Kings 25, 1-3. If you want to look that up in your time and take a look at it. It was a very terrible time. They were eating their babies. They were doing all kinds of things in that siege.
What was
Yes.
that scripture again in Kings?
It was 2 Kings
Okay,
25, verses 1-3.
thank you.
Now, actually, you can read, there's a lot more to it, but that's
Mhm.
primarily the siege. Anyway, he came to Jerusalem, he took Jehoiakim captive, and in one place it says he took him back to Babylon, but we find out he actually died in Jerusalem. But whether he took him and he allowed him to go back, or he started to take him in, he died on the way, we don't know. But he was not buried in the with the kings of Israel.
What was Jehoiakim's relationship again to Nebuchadnezzar?
He didn't have a relationship to him. Jehoiakim was a son of Josiah, King Josiah of Judah, who was a very godly man. But his kids, his younger son, was put on the throne because they thought he was more able than Jehoiakim to be king. Well, neither one of them were able to be king. I mean, they were both completely inept and, of course, ungodly. But Nebuchadnezzar took the younger son out and put Jehoiakim in his place.
Okay.
I think that's all in 2 Kings, also in that same area. Okay, so that's the background of what happened here. So he notices also, this comes up a little bit later, he took the vessels and put them into the treasury of his God. Anytime the world wants to take anything from the church, they always want to put it in their own treasury. They want to put it where, it's going to show some prestige for them. Okay, verse 3. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. This is how we know they were probably royalty. Children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Okay? So here we find that Ashpenaz, who was the head of the eunuchs, and by the way, in the courts of that day, and it was quite interesting, up until the mid-1800s in Turkey, they had exactly the same thing still going on. And so we have a lot of history based on what was going on in Turkey, which was exactly the same as what went on in Babylon. But the eunuchs were placed in charge of the harems. And it was their responsibility to take care of these harems, which consisted, of course, of the king's wives and concubines and that sort of thing. And what would happen, you put a eunuch in there, and if he did an exceptionally good job, and he was really liked by his master, he would progress up the line. And it was not unusual for these men to be placed into very high positions, ministers of this and that traveled the world. They were very, very highly schooled in the courts and what had to be the ceremony of the court of whatever country it was. They were highly schooled in all of that. They were well educated because it was their responsibility to take care of the harem and make sure they were taken care of and that they were presentable to go before the king. And we know from Esther, Esther was not, the king of Israel was not unusual. This was in every one of those countries, the same idea. She had to be so just perfect before she walked into the king. It was the eunuch's responsibility to see that that was carried out. That was their job. So they held a lot of responsibility, and they had the opportunity to constantly be in contact with the king. They were the ones who could walk into the king at will and talk to him, because they were there all the time. They were the valet, if you will. They were the ones that took care of him. Yes?
Well, would they be more like personal servants or more like a cabinet, or
No, they
both?
started off, or both, they started off primarily as personal servant type things, and then of course they progressed through, and as they went up the line, they became very important.
Well, ultimately, maybe even as diplomats?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, they were diplomats, absolutely, yes. They became diplomats and all because they were so well schooled. They could go into anybody, any king's court, and you never had to worry that they were going to do a faux pas on you, you know, they were going to walk in or do something stupid. They knew how to act. And if you remember the Queen of Sheba, when she went into Solomon's court, what was her comment? Even the eunuchs are much more, the terms that she used, much more graceful, much more presentable than the best in my court. Even their eunuchs are better than anything I've got, you know? Talking about Solomon's court. So this was who they were. So this was the head of the eunuchs, and he was charged with finding the best. And they were they could tell right away if they had somebody who was really good or somebody who was, you know, faking it or wasn't really that intelligent. So they looked for those that were intelligent, wise, and skillful. Now understand, these were young men. These were not guys in their 30s. These were young men, probably teenagers, that had a jump on everybody else. They already had a good understanding of the sciences and of the things that went on in Israel. Some of the sciences that the Hebrews had were music, architecture, natural history, agriculture, morals, theology, war, and the knowledge of future events. Now this is important because one of the things that was so prevalent in Babylon was a thirst to know what's going to happen. In fact, the Chaldeans are credited as being the first astronomers. I found it really fascinating. I was flipping through the Discovery Channel here, well, it was probably several months ago. They had one of these things on Bible events, you know, Bible events explained by science type thing. And I usually, you know, I flip through those and they're usually, you know, pretty stupid. And I saw one where they were pulling big nets up to catch the quail in the wilderness, and you know, there was all kinds of stupid things. And I thought, yeah, that's really bright. Those quail are going to come right into those nets and feed so many million people. But you know, or that the wind blew across the Red Sea just right in this one particular place, and it's only knee deep. And, yeah, okay, so how did Pharaoh drown? But anyway, this particular one was really interesting because they were talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone. And these were some scientists that had done some studies, and they went back into that period of time to see if anybody had noticed anything peculiar. And they went to the Chaldeans, and lo and behold, here was a scientist in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, in the Chaldeans, and he was keeping sky charts. And so, and when you think about it, these were basically shepherd people, so they were used to being out at night watching their sheep, and so they were watching the stars. Well, probably, if you did nothing else to do, you're going to sit there and say, well, connect those dots, and I get a lion, connect those, I get a bear, you know, type thing. And, you know, little games that you would play if you were out there with nothing else to do with your time. But this guy was actually charting the skies. And he had the main stars, you could tell on his tablet what they were. Well, he writes, and he actually drew pictures of something he saw about the time of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it looks like a comet, a small comet. And he actually traces it coming in across the sky. It's amazing. It was over several days, I guess, that he saw this little thing coming and kept tracing it. And then he has this big picture of it as it goes by. Well, they were able to line up the stars to find out where he was and then go back on the sky charts to that particular date and time. And they found, lo and behold, if a comet or a large meteor or whatever it might have been came across, the angle would have taken it just over Sodom and Gomorrah and landed into, I forget where the country was. And so they did some computer simulations to see what would happen if this were to be the case. When it hit, what would happen is all of this stuff would come back this way. You know, it would impact and ricochet. And guess where it landed? Right on Sodom and Gomorrah. And then they went and found, and sure enough, they found craters. So I don't know how God did it. Maybe he did, but it was interesting to me to find out here was an old astronomer sitting out there in the field. Maybe he was watching his sheep while he was doing this, who had actually seen this event and tracked it and put it into his drawings of the skies that he had. But they were very much aware of astronomy and what was happening, the seasons and how things changed. And of course they were into astrology then. That was the next logical step, was how does a star affect humanity? And that's where, of course, we had the science of astrology came from there. So they were hungry for this sort of information. And here was somebody who could tell the future. The Israelites were known for their prophets. You know, guys like Isaiah, guys like, of course, Abraham foretold the future, and David foretold the future. These were, we don't think of them necessarily as prophets, but they prophesied. They told what was going to happen. I mean, here, how else can you give it but Abraham standing there and says, I see a city whose builder and maker is God. It's different. It's a different city. I see it. And of course, the writings of David. So they were known for being able to see the future, and this intrigued Nebuchadnezzar. He wanted to see the future. Now, they were to be schooled in the courts. Now, this wasn't just a matter of, we read this verse, it looks like they had to be real pretty when they came in to see the king, which is true. In those days, they equated physical physique with power, with being smart, intelligent. The bearing that you had was very, very important in the courts of the king. Now we say courts of the king, and we usually kind of think about, gee, the king sitting on the court, and here's the little court, and everybody's in there. But we're really talking about the whole political and the whole of society, if you will, at the upper echelons of society. That was really what the court was. That was everything that went on in the rich folks and those in politics and so forth. It was that whole circle of events that was going on. So these young men were to be brought into Babylon. They were to be schooled not only in physical physique. They were to work out. They had to be physically fit. They looked good. But they were also trained in all of the sciences of Babylon. They had to learn the Chaldean language so that they could speak it fluently without any accents or anything like that. And they were to go through this for 3 years. 3 years. I think it's interesting that the disciples had 3 years to learn everything from the Lord, which included physical and spiritual. There was a lot he taught them, if you read through the life in the Gospels. It's just to throw that out there. I don't know if it's connected or not, but I just think it's interesting.
No, but it's a coincidence.
Yeah, I don't believe in coincidence in the Bible personally, but,
No, but
All right, so they had, what's that?
tendency there for 3 years in this, and then the disciples had 3 years
That's right.
walking with Jesus.
Yeah. And there's some other things here we're going to look at here in a minute that I think are interesting. All right, the last thing was they were to be fed with the finest food in Babylon. Now, this food happened to be food from the king's table. Now, it didn't mean that when they put it on the table, somebody went in there and dished up all the food for them, or that they necessarily sat at the same table with the king. What this was is the king had his own kitchens, obviously. And so when they prepared food for the king, that was purchased special. That was the best of the crops. And it wasn't just meat. We think, we've come to think of meat as being from an animal. But meat could be anything. Vegetable, meat just means food. So it was the finest food that they could find. It's the difference between going to Joe's Cafe down here and having a steak and going to the Metropolitan Grill in Seattle or Ruth Chris Steakhouse and having a steak. You haven't had a steak till you had one of their steaks, if this is all you've been eating. Not that they're not just good cooks on both ends, but the meat where it starts is entirely different. these high-priced restaurants, they send guys out and they look for the very best, and that's what they buy. When the fishing boats come in, they're the first ones there, they pick the very best because they pay the best price for it. So what was being offered to these boys wasn't just an idea of some meat that the king ate. This was the finest, the freshest, the best prepared. Not only the meat, but the wine. The best of the wine. You know, Jesus, when he was at the feast in Canaan, they said, what? After he turned the water into wine, they said, well, this is unusual. You saved the best wine to last. In other words, this was the best. This was the best you could buy. And he didn't have to buy it. He made it. But they were offered all of this. Okay. Verse 5. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So at the end of 3 years, they were going to have a meeting with the king, and he was going to find out how well these guys had progressed. Okay? Verse 6. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Abednego. Of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. I should turn the page and read first. Okay, so the first thing they did with these guys is rename them. And I'll just go through there in your book, there in here, but let's go real quickly. Daniel meant judge of God. Hananiah means whom Jehovah has graciously given. Mishael, who means who is what God is. And Azariah, whom Jehovah helps. We're given the Chaldean names Belteshazzar, which is Baal's prince. Shadrach, young friend of the king. Meshach, a little sheep. And Abednego, a servant of Nego, or Nebo, if you will. Which was Saturn, I believe. One of the planets. And Ashpenaz was the one who named them. Now, why would they give them new names?
We're going to assimilate them into their way.
Yeah, he was going to assimilate them. But there was also another reason for giving them names. You notice all these names were tied to their religion. Every time Daniel heard the name Daniel, judge of God. So what were they doing? They were separating them not only from their country, but separating them from their religion. Because when he heard Belteshazzar, oh, that's Baal's prince. So there was a method in what they were doing. They wanted to not only separate them from their country, they wanted to separate them from their religion. They wanted to put them in a position where they could best learn and be assimilated, as John said, into their society. But not just assimilated, but becomes leaders of their society. It's the way the military does it today. They don't take your religion away, thank God, at least not yet. But they separate you from everything. Put you out to boot camp, you don't get anything, you don't talk to anybody. You know, it's that same approach as they want to tear you down so they can build you up. And that's what they were doing here. Now look at verse 8. But Daniel, I notice he never calls himself Belteshazzar. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now there's a very, very powerful thing that's going on here in Daniel's life. And I've heard preachers get up and say, well, it was against the law to eat anything from the king's table. Against the law to eat anything offered to idols. Anybody show me a scripture where it says that? I find it in the New Testament. I do not find it in the Old Testament. Now, I might be wrong, maybe I've just missed it. If so, somebody find it and show it to me, will you? The point here is that Daniel didn't have to have somebody walk up and say, it says right here you can't do that. See, he purposed in his heart. He was not going to defile himself. And I don't know that it was so much a problem that this was offered to idols. And I don't even know that the meat was offered to idols. Now, we do know that they offered a sacrificial part of their meals to idols, whatever. Probably not all the time. In Thanksgiving, type thing. When we pray, they would offer us, to their idols. But I think there was something else even much deeper than this. Daniel realized that if he were allowed to eat the finest of everything, if he could have all the wine and the abundance that's there, what would the temptation be? We look at the wine, that's obvious. I mean, if you could have all the wine, the finest wine you could get, you know what kind of a drunken mess you could turn yourself into in a real big hurry. But think about the food. You're eating the richest, the finest food there is. And you can eat all of it you want.
Give me more.
Yeah. Where would your contemplation go? Where would your focus go? To me, I'm getting the finest. I am really somebody. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he was not going to defile himself. He wasn't worried about sin, by the way. He was worrying about defiling something. That means changing it for something that it was not intended to be. So what did he do? He requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he not eat that stuff. Now I want you to notice, now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now a lot of people have taken that phrase tender love and said, oh my, Daniel must have been, a little on that side of the fence. Or was a eunuch himself. But that tender love is not with the connotation that it has today. What it really meant was that he brought him into such a place with this eunuch, the head of the eunuchs, that they had this empathy for each other. There was a caring for each other. It's called tender love, but really it was a matter of mercy and compassion and pity. Well, you think about it, you've got a eunuch here, he's never going to have children, family, so on. And you've got a guy who's a captive. So they have a certain empathy with each other. There was some compassion for each other. There was some understanding between each other. And so this brought them into this close relationship. The term that's used for tender love here is rechem. And that means mercy, compassion, or pity. You could call it tender love, but it's that same idea. So he had gained this favor. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me in danger. Then shall ye make me in danger, my head to the king. In other words, he's saying, if you go in there after 3 years, and you're looking downcast, and you've been starving, and you don't look healthy, and you're downcast, which is really what this is talking about, more than not being fat or whatever. It's the countenance of the face. If you walk in that way, I'm liable to lose my head. I'm in danger. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So Daniel said, hey, let's try something out here. Let's do a test for 10 days. You're going to feed us nothing but water and vegetables for 10 days. Water and vegetables. Now, I've heard some people say pulse was a porridge, and I've heard all kinds of things. But really what it was vegetables. It was a vegetable diet. We're going to be vegetarians. And you just bring in these vegetables and water. No wine. I don't want the finest, of the king's table. I just want vegetables and water. And let's do it for 10 days and see what happens. Okay? Fair trial. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. Verse 15, and at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. After 10 days, these guys were so much more vibrant, more healthy, more alive than all the rest of them that had come over with them as captives. Or even the young men in the court, as far as that's concerned. They were far better physically than the rest of them after 10 days. So, what happened? Well, thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and gave the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse till they got what they wanted. So for 3 years, Daniel and the other his three friends, ate nothing but vegetables and water. As for these 4 children, I want you to notice this. God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Well, they were in learning for 3 years in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar. But I firmly believe they could have been out in the desert and got just as smart if God wanted it that way. Because God was honoring, they were honoring their commitment to put Him first and them second. You know, we think about it and, well, they ate vegetables and water. I don't know if I could eat vegetables and water for 3 years. I like steak too well, to be honest. I don't know if I could do that. But because Daniel's focus was not on himself, but on God, and because Daniel said, I am not going to eat the king's meat or drink the king's wine. I do not want to defile myself. I don't want to take away from what God wants me to be. I don't want to lose my focus on God. Because he took that stand and was willing to go 3 years without all the finery, look what God gave him. And by the way, following Jesus for 3 years meant giving up your fishing, giving up your tax collecting, giving up your medical practice. Following Jesus meant walking from place to place, not having a house to stay under, having to leave your family behind. Do you see some similarities here? And look what Jesus gave them at the end of 3 years. When you read the New Testament, when you read the Gospels, not just the Gospel, but the writings of Peter, for instance, it's amazing what Peter, who was an ignorant fisherman, picked up in 3 years. I went to Bible school for 4 years, and I could never pick that up. All that vast amount of understanding. Believe me, there's a lot in there. Because what he writes is not just surface and frivolous little things on top. He's got a lot of depth of understanding that went behind those words. All the disciples that wrote Read their, I mean, it's amazing. And they picked it up in 3 years. Why? Because God increased their wisdom and understanding because they were willing to separate themselves from all the finery and separate themselves from those parts of the world that would defile them and cause them not to keep their focus on where they needed to be. There's a lot of lesson here, isn't there? Okay. Verse 18. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Everybody came in. Everybody they brought from Judah came in. And I'm sure there was a lot of them that were from the court within Babylon. You know, this was a big deal. We're going to pick, this was the time when the king was going to pick those that were going to be elevated to high positions. This wasn't just a, well, let's go see what you've done for me today approach. This was a big deal. This was 3 years in the making. Now, this was a big deal. They all came in before the king. But only 4 stood before the king. There's a lesson here. You see, when we're willing to put ourselves in the shoes of Daniel and say, I am not going to allow myself to be defiled. I am not going to allow myself to lose focus that God is preeminent and I am the nobody behind God. I'm just here to do what God wants. When we keep that kind of a focus to the point that we're saying, God, whatever you want, I'm willing to do. Missionaries to me, they blow my mind sometimes. You know, to willing to say, hey, I'm just going to, okay, you want me, okay, let's go. Away we go. Where do you want me? Oh, you want me in the back jungle someplace? Okay, let's go. You know, for years I could never figure that one out. I guess I'm just too tied to society. I probably won't be one that gets to stand before him one of these days. But, you know, I don't understand how you can just do that. But they do it, and they do it over and over again. Oh, it doesn't matter. Well, I guess I shouldn't really say that. I do kind of understand. For years I never owned homes. I traveled all around California. Wherever I was needed, I went. And it was rough on my wife and kids, but you know, we'd just take up stakes and somebody else had a church open, they needed somebody to come and take the church. Okay, I'll go do that. Yeah, I'm available. Off we'd go. And God always, for some reason, always, my job would terminate. Somebody would call me within a couple of days, say, we have a church, would you be interested? Yeah, I just happen to be available. When do you need me? We need you next weekend. Well, it'll take me a week to move. You know, and we'd take off. And I pastored a lot of little churches, did a lot of that. And I never wanted to own a house because I always felt like God was going to call me somewhere else. You know, I didn't want to have to mess trying to sell something. So for years I didn't invest in homes or anything like that. Not because I didn't see it was important, but I was really wanting more to do what God wanted. That's when I was in a pulpit ministry, which I'm not in these days, but I haven't been for years. But I can understand a little bit of that, but not to the degree that Daniel does here. But the point is, at the end of the time, they stood before the king. The rest of them remained seated. They were the ones he called forward. They were the ones he were put in the high positions. And I'm wondering, you know, this is talking, of course, about Nebuchadnezzar standing before the king, but we're going to stand before a greater king than he one of these days. And you know, the Bible says he's going to ask us what we did. And depending on what we did is where we're going to stand. And there's just so much in here. Verse 20. and in all matters of wisdom and understanding, that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even until the first year of King Cyrus. Now you talk about being smart. Now these were not kids that were raised in the home of an astronomer. They were not raised in the home of a magician or a charmer or a one who gave incantations. Incantations, I guess you'd call them. So that was not handed down from them from generation to generation like the ones in Chaldea would have been. The magicians there, like the shaman today, you know, you're a shaman, your son becomes a shaman or whatever, you know, and you get all of this training through your whole life. But look what he says. They were 10 times better than anything he had anywhere. They learned all of this stuff so much better that they were 10 times better. Now, you know, some preachers get a little upset about this. What do you mean? We're doing magic stuff, you know? I don't necessarily know that they were doing the magic stuff, because we think about magicians and we think about, you know, the cult stuff, you know, and the taboos and all that stuff. There was far more to it than that. These magicians were able to do a lot of things, and we saw that in Pharaoh's court, by the way, where they were able to turn their rods into snakes, and they were able to do a lot of things. So they were intelligent. They knew how to manipulate nature to a certain degree. But Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children, they were even better. And they were so good that Daniel continued in high office even into the first year of Cyrus, in which he was then an old man. Okay, any questions? That's our first chapter for tonight. On the back of your sheets, by the way, I've made that little picture back there. We'll be referring to this, so I'll try to include those on some more sheets. Maybe I'll clear it up, make it a little easier to understand. This is out of a huge chart that I've got, a book of charts that Jim loaned me. If you want that, I'll try to remember to bring the name of the book to you. It costs like $14 or $15 from Amazon.com, which is very reasonable. But I was excited when I saw it. I'm still excited. I opened it up. Oh man, it's cool. But it lays everything out in a linear order, and I'll be referring to that. But you want to look through it, you can kind of figure out what it is and how it works. This is only a little portion of it, so it doesn't have all the dates and stuff on it to help you out. Any questions, anything? Comments? By the way, if you missed some of the lesson sheets, I have some of them with me. Some of them I'm going to have to recopy. So if you need some of those chapters, if you know which ones you need.
You mean Isaiah?
You have a list of them?
Yeah, the ones I need.
Yeah, I may have some of them with me. If I do, I'll get them to you tonight. The ones I don't, I'll copy for you next week.
The last lesson that you
What's
did,
that?
because I wasn't here. The last lesson.
Okay, I have that. I do have that one. And I have the DVDs. I've got to get some more DVDs. I'm out of them. So as soon as I get another deal of them, when I have 14 hours. So,
You get some spare time, huh?
when I have some spare time to copy them guys off, I'll run some off and we'll have some for you. I got to do some for Rick too, so he has. There's about 40 some hours there, so there's a lot of material we went over. It's surprising how much was there. All right, I'll tell you what, I've got some, I don't know if anybody wants it, there's some apple crisp back there. And
Oh, yeah, I want it.
And I have some Tillamook vanilla ice cream to go with it.
Ooh.
And we have coffee, so feel free to stick around and indulge if you wish. I'll warn you, I fixed it, so I don't know.
I got it.
But my insurance is good, I think.
Kathy, what she's.
So we can do it.
Kathy, do you know what you're gonna bring to the bridge?
I think I'll probably, let's see, string beans with